It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday morning at Brookfield High. I was in the middle of my sophomore literature class explaining the difference between imagery and metaphor when the sound came. 3 sharp cracks cut through the hum of the building like a metal rod against concrete. The noise echoed down the corridor so loud, it silenced every voice in my classroom instantly. The students froze. Some stared at the ceiling, others looked at me with wide eyes as if I could explain it. My chalk stopped midway across the board. At first I tried to tell myself it could be construction outside or maybe a locker door slammed 3 times in a row. But the air in the room shifted the kind of shift you feel in your gut, not your ears. Something about those noises didn't belong in a school. Before I could say anything, the intercom crackled to life. Principal Henderson's voice spilled into the room, chipper and false, every word strained with forced calm. "Attention, students and staff," he said. "Don't be alarmed. The sounds you've heard are simply contractors working on the new ventilation system above the main wing. Everything is perfectly fine. Please remain focused on your lessons and continue with instructional time." His words should have reassured me, but instead my stomach dropped. Contractors. There were no work orders scheduled for that week, I knew, because the teachers had been complaining for months that our heating system was broken and the district kept delaying repairs. Henderson's voice wasn't calm reassurance, it was cover. I set my chalk down and reached for the classroom phone, dialing the front office. The secretary, Ms. Daniels, picked up, and I whispered urgently that we needed to initiate a lockdown. I said the sounds weren't construction and that I wanted my students safe, but I never got to finish. A deeper voice cut across the line. Henderson had grabbed the receiver. "Miss Avery," he hissed low enough so the students couldn't hear, but sharp enough to slice straight through me. "Stop this nonsense right now." "Sir, with respect." "No," he snapped. "You will not cause unnecessary panic. I said it was construction, and that's final. If you disrupt the school day with your paranoia, I will personally remove you from that building. And you can explain yourself to the school board when they review your teaching license." My heart pounded. I wanted to argue, to shout that the sound was wrong, that no roofing crew in the world made noises like that. But I also knew every second I stayed on the phone, 30 students were watching me, reading my face for cues about whether they were safe. Henderson's words were meant to intimidate, and they worked. Fear twisted my chest, not just of the noises outside, but of what my principal might do to my career. I hung up my hand trembling and turned back to my students. They were silent, their notebooks open, but forgotten. A boy in the second row whispered, "Mr. Avery was... That was it, a gun?" I opened my mouth, but the only answer I could manage was to shake my head slowly and tell them to stay calm. The problem was, I wasn't calm. Henderson's announcement replayed in my mind. He'd sounded so desperate to maintain control, so invested in pretending everything was fine, that he was willing to threaten me rather than face the possibility of danger. It was a dangerous kind of denial, the kind that prioritized appearances over lives. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere far away, a door slammed, the echo rolling down the tiled hallway. One of the girls flinched, hugging her arms to her chest. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second stretching thin as wire. I tried to keep teaching, stumbling over the next line in the lesson, but my eyes kept darting to the door. The students noticed, they always notice. Henderson wanted us to act like nothing had happened, but how could I when the air smelled faintly of smoke, when the silence outside our classroom felt predatory? Then the second round of noises came sharper, closer, impossible to mistake. They weren't the clang of tools or the creak of old pipes. They were deliberate, violent, and followed by a scream that sliced through the hallway like a blade. Every head in the classroom whipped toward me. No one moved, no one breathed. My blood turned cold. And then, as if to tighten the noose, Henderson's voice returned over the intercom, louder now, brittle around the edges. "Teachers, please remain calm," he said. "The drama department is rehearsing a scene today. Don't let it disturb your classes. Everything is under control. Again, please continue with normal instructional time." Normal. The word felt obscene. My students were clinging to one another, their phones buzzing with frantic texts. A girl in the front row whispered that her friend had just texted her from the science wing someone was walking through the halls with a weapon. I wanted to believe she was mistaken, that teenagers had exaggerated, but the way her hands shook told me she wasn't inventing this. I glanced back at the intercom, half expecting Henderson to bark another command, half hoping he'd admit he was wrong. But he doubled down, his voice slicing in again. "Any teacher who initiates lockdown procedures without my authorization will face immediate termination. Do not incite panic. Do not spread rumors. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action up to and including revocation of your license." The words hung in the air like smoke. My students stared at me, their faces pale, searching for direction. They didn't care about my job security or the superintendent's wrath. They cared about whether they were about to die. And I realized standing there with my hand still on the classroom phone that I was caught between two impossible orders: obey my superior and risk 30 young lives, or disobey and possibly lose the career I'd built my entire adult life. The choice was coming, inevitable as gravity. I could feel it pressing down on me, heavier than Henderson's threats, heavier than the chalk dust on my palms. The first 3 bangs had already rewritten the day, and denial could no longer protect us. The moment Principal Henderson's last warning faded from the intercom, the classroom filled with a silence so sharp it cut. My students sat frozen, phones glowing in their hands. A few of them were already reading messages that contradicted everything Henderson had just told us. Someone said there's blood in the main hallway. My brother texted they're hiding in the band room. Ms. Flores locked her kids in the art supply closet. Each whisper piled on top of the last, and I could see the panic rising like water in a sinking boat. My instinct screamed at me to act, even as Henderson's threats echoed in my skull. Lose your job, lose your license, lose everything. But then I looked at the 30 faces turned toward me, faces too young to process what was really happening, yet old enough to understand they were in danger. A girl in the back row, Lauren, had tears streaming down her cheeks. A boy near the door, Kyle, whispered a prayer under his breath. They weren't worried about Henderson's orders. They were worried about surviving. That was the moment I stopped caring about the principal's voice on the intercom. "All right, everyone," I said quietly but firmly, "we're going into lockdown. Right now." For a second, they just stared at me like they weren't sure they'd heard correctly. Then I clapped my hands, not in anger, but in urgency. "Move the desks, push them against the door, stack the chairs. We need a barricade." The room burst into motion. Desks screeched across the tile floor, chairs clattered, backpacks toppled over. The noise was chaotic, but it was purposeful. Even the students who were shaking helped lift furniture, their adrenaline giving them strength. I pulled the shades down over the windows and flipped the light switch until the room sank into semi-darkness. "Phones on silent," I whispered. "No vibrations, no sounds. Only text if you must." One boy tried to protest, but Mr. Avery Henderson said, "I know what he said." I cut him off, my voice lower now but unshakable. "And I know what I'm saying. Trust me." They did. Whether out of fear or belief, they obeyed. I dug into my pocket for my cell phone, the one Henderson couldn't control. With hands trembling only slightly, I dialed 911. A dispatcher answered almost immediately, her voice calm but clipped as if she had already fielded several calls like mine. "911, what's your emergency?" I whispered. "This is Brookfield High School. I'm a teacher in room 214. We've barricaded. There's an active threat in the building. The principal is refusing to initiate a lockdown." There was a pause, then the dispatcher said, "We've received multiple calls from your location. Units are already en route. Stay where you are, keep the door secure, and remain silent." The words confirmed everything. I wasn't imagining it. Other teachers had called too. Henderson's denial wasn't reality, it was obstruction. When I hung up, I turned back to my class. They were huddled together in the farthest corner, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around one another. The barricade at the door looked clumsy but solid, a wall of scratched desks and wobbling chairs that felt like our only shield against whatever prowled outside. I crouched down to their level, trying to meet their eyes, to look steadier than I felt. "The police are on their way. We're staying put. You're safe in here. Safe." The word felt like a promise I couldn't fully guarantee, but it was the only rope I could throw them. The building outside seemed to come alive. Somewhere above, heavy footsteps pounded. A scream echoed, cut short by something I didn't want to imagine. The intercom flickered again, Henderson's voice now sharp, trembling with anger instead of confidence. "Teachers, I repeat, no unauthorized actions. Anyone caught locking doors, barricading rooms, or calling outside authorities will be subject to immediate termination and possible legal action for inciting panic. Do not defy me." His words were nearly drowned out by the sound of running feet in the hallway. Through the narrow slit in the classroom window, I caught a glimpse of another teacher, half dragging, half carrying a sobbing student into a nearby room. The sight nearly broke me. Henderson wasn't protecting us, he was gambling with us. I pulled out my phone again, this time opening my contacts. My fingers flew as I texted every colleague whose number I had. "Barricade now. Don't wait for him. Police are coming. Stay low." One by one replies came back. "Already locked down. Thank you, wasn't sure what to do. He's out of his mind." The solidarity gave me strength. I wasn't alone in defying him. In the corner, Lauren whispered, "What if they come here?" I didn't know how to answer. Instead, I moved to the supply closet and pulled out the only thing that resembled a weapon, an old aluminum baseball bat left over from some forgotten fundraiser. I gripped it tightly, the cold metal grounding me in a way words couldn't. The students watched, some with wide eyes, some with relief. Seeing me hold something, even something so inadequate, seemed to calm them. It told them I was willing to stand between them and danger, even if all I had was a dented bat. Minutes stretched into hours in my mind. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps. Every muffled bang made my muscles tense. Henderson's voice returned once more over the intercom, thinner this time, desperate. "Everyone return to your lessons immediately. There is no threat. Anyone spreading rumors will be dealt with," but his words no longer carried weight. Not after the screams, the texts, the dispatcher's confirmation. The truth was louder than his lies. I knelt again beside my students, whispering so quietly they had to lean in to hear me. "Whatever happens, stay down, stay together. Don't move unless I tell you." They nodded, eyes shining in the dim light. The decision was made. Career, reputation, authority, all of it could crumble. It didn't matter, because in that moment my only responsibility was the 30 lives pressed into the corner of room 214. And deep inside, beneath the fear, I felt a strange clarity. If defiance was the only path to survival, then defiance was the only choice. The building had grown eerily still. Our desks were stacked high against the classroom door, the shades drawn, the lights off. My students huddled in silence, breaths shallow, every ear straining for the smallest sound. That's when the footsteps came. Heavy at first, deliberate, then softer, as if the person was enjoying the suspense of moving closer. My hands tightened around the aluminum bat until my knuckles burned. From the corner, I saw Lauren press her hands over her mouth to stop a sob from escaping. Kyle whispered another prayer, this one shaking. Then 3 deafening cracks. The door rattled as bullets punched through the wood, each shot tearing splinters into the air. Screams erupted before I hissed quiet. The holes glowed faintly with light from the hallway, the smell of burned powder seeping into the room. Through one of those jagged holes I saw movement. An eye. Cold, unblinking, staring straight at me. It took a moment for recognition to click. The boy staring at me was not a stranger. It was Mason Keller, a former student of mine. He had been in my English class 2 years earlier, a quiet kid with messy hair who used to write poetry about rivers and storms. Last spring, Principal Henderson had expelled him after a fight in the cafeteria, refusing to even hear his explanation. Now here he was, older but still unmistakable, with that same wild curl in his hair and a smile that made my stomach twist. "Mason," I whispered without meaning to. His smile widened a hollow grin with no warmth. Slowly he raised the gun and aimed it at the door, at me, at the 30 souls crouched behind me. I froze. Every instinct screamed to duck, to hide, but my body stayed rooted in front of the barricade. My students were behind me. If Mason fired again, I had to be the wall. The metallic click of the trigger echoed through the hole. My heart stopped. But nothing happened. He pulled again. Click. Still nothing. The third time the sound was sharper, more frantic. Click, click. But the gun refused to fire. My knees trembled, nearly giving out. Mason's grin faltered, confusion flickering across his face. For a moment, time stretched thin and fragile, and I felt 30 pairs of eyes watching my back, waiting for the end. Then, without a word, Mason lowered the weapon. He stared at me for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds. His gaze was unreadable anger, emptiness, maybe even disappointment that fate had robbed him of his performance. And then he turned. We listened as his footsteps receded down the hallway, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. My students didn't cheer or sigh in relief. They just clung tighter to one another, some trembling, some quietly crying. I forced myself to breathe, forced my hands to unclench from the bat, but when I looked down, the metal was slick with sweat, my palms raw. One student tugged at my sleeve, holding up a phone. A text message glowed on the screen, Hess trying doors. "First floor, don't open." We were on the first floor. The air thickened with the acrid smell of smoke trickling under the door. Something somewhere was burning. One boy whispered, "Should we run for it?" I shook my head instantly. "No. We stay put. The barricade is our best chance." But the smoke grew heavier, stinging our eyes, making coughs harder to suppress. From beyond the barricade came more sounds, doors slamming, glass shattering. Then a horrible laugh that didn't sound human. My students pressed themselves against the farthest wall, as if sheer distance could keep them safe. The footsteps returned right outside our door. The handle rattled once, then again harder. The barricade groaned. A loud crash followed, the whole frame shaking. 30 bodies held their breath in unison. Through the bullet holes, I caught sight of a figure crawling across the hall floor. My breath caught Principal Henderson. His pristine suit was torn, his shirt soaked with blood. He was dragging himself forward on his elbows, glancing behind him in terror. His lips formed a single word as his eyes met mine through the hole. "Help." Before I could move, something yanked him back into the shadows. His scream was cut short. Then Mason's shadow filled the hallway again, looming at our door. He leaned close enough that I saw the glint of his eye through the hole, studied me like a specimen under glass. My students were so silent behind me I could barely tell they were there. I raised the bat. Ridiculous as it was all I had. My hands shook, but I refused to lower it. Mason didn't fire this time. He didn't need to. He just smiled through the gap, the kind of smile that said he knew exactly how powerless we were. Then, just as before, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the smoke and screams further down the hall. The silence that followed was unbearable. My chest ached from holding my breath. I kept the bat raised, waiting for him to return, waiting for the doorknob to twist again. But instead, what we heard next were shouts louder, commanding, overlapping, "Drop the weapon, hands where I can see them, on the ground now, police." Or at least I prayed it was. My students broke into muffled sobs, a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone else was finally here. Terror that the confrontation might make things even worse. I lowered the bat slowly, my arms trembling, and turned to them. "Stay low," I whispered. "Don't move until they come for us. We're not opening this door." They nodded, some still crying, some staring blankly. The bullet holes in the door were the only proof that what just happened wasn't a nightmare. Proof that Mason had been there. Proof that we had been one misfire away from death. I sank down beside them, still gripping the bat, my mind racing with the image of Henderson's bloodied body being dragged away. And though we were still alive, I realized something chilling. Survival didn't feel like safety. It felt like a reprieve, temporary and fragile, hanging by the thinnest thread. For a long stretch of minutes, all we heard were muffled shouts, boots pounding against the linoleum, and the occasional crash of doors being forced open. The smoke that had been creeping under our barricade was thicker now, burning our throats, making students cough into their sleeves. The classroom felt like a sealed box, filling slowly with fear and heat. Then came the knock. At first it was gentle, then firmer. Through one of the bullet holes, a face appeared hidden beneath a helmet visor, down the beam of a tactical flashlight sweeping across the room. My grip on the bat tightened until the stranger held up a badge and mouthed the words, "Police, stay there." My students stirred a ripple of hope and dread. Some began to cry harder, convinced this was rescue. Others pressed themselves tighter against the wall, terrified it was another trick. The officer didn't open the door. Instead, he gave me a signal palm, flat downward motion. "Stay calm. Wait." Then he disappeared, leaving us in the dark again with only the smoke for company. Minutes bled into more minutes. The coughs grew harsher. One girl, Mia, wheezed into her inhaler, but it wasn't working well. Her lips had turned a shade too pale. I knew she needed fresh air, but cracking the window felt like broadcasting our location. Finally, the same face returned to the bullet hole. This time, his voice carried through. "We need to verify." Code word from dispatch. I remembered instantly. "Pineapple juice," I whispered hoarsely. He nodded. Relief washed over me so hard I nearly collapsed. "All right," he said, "start clearing the barricade quietly." My students scrambled to obey, their arms trembling as they dragged desks and chairs away from the door. But another officer appeared behind the first and shook his head. He pointed to the smoke curling from our vents, then tapped the window. "We're taking you out this way," he said. He raised the butt of his rifle and smashed the glass. Shards rained to the floor in glittering fragments, the sound like another gunshot that made half the class scream. The officer cleared the frame with swift, practiced movements. "Everyone through," he ordered, one at a time. "Let's go!" The students hesitated. It wasn't easy to crawl through shattered glass into the unknown. But the sight of armed men in tactical gear, the reassurance of authority, pushed them forward. The smaller kids went first, boosted by officers outside. The taller ones followed, swinging shaky legs over the sill. I counted each one as they climbed out, 1, 2, 5, 10. Each time someone disappeared into the hands of waiting officers, my chest loosened a fraction. When Lauren, the girl who'd been sobbing from the first shot, climbed through, she grabbed my hand for a moment. I squeezed back, whispering, "You're okay? Go." Mia came next, carried by two officers who had slipped in through the window. They strapped an oxygen mask over her face and whisked her toward the triage area set up in the parking lot. I wanted to follow her instantly, but more students needed me. The line moved slowly, every child fragile in their terror. One boy stumbled halfway through and froze his legs, refusing to swing over the sill. I lifted him under the arms, pushing until he made it into the waiting hands outside. Finally, there was one left, Sarah, always quiet, always tucked in the back row. She lingered paralyzed until I gently guided her forward. She climbed out, then turned and caught my wrist. For a second, I saw not just fear, but something like gratitude. She didn't speak, just squeezed, then disappeared into the smoke outside. That left only me. I slung the bat against my leg one last time, reluctant to let it go. Then I climbed onto the sill and looked back into the classroom. The desks were still half stacked against the door, papers scattered across the floor. Dark stains marred the carpet near the doorway where smoke drifted thicker. It was a scene I knew would follow me forever. The officer outside steadied me as I dropped to the ground. The air outside was sharp and cold, cutting through the smoke that clung to my lungs. The parking lot was chaos. Parents sprinted toward the perimeter, screaming their children's names. Officers held them back behind police tape, guiding students into designated reunion zones. Sirens wailed, lights painted the walls red and blue. I started counting again, 27, 28, 29. But 30 never came. "Where's Marcus?" I asked aloud, panic rising. Marcus, the boy who usually sat in the back, quiet, unnoticed. A girl spoke up, trembling. "He went to the bathroom before the first noises." My stomach dropped. I grabbed the nearest officer, babbling Marcus' description. The officer related into his radio, his voice professional and calm, so calm it almost made me sick. Within minutes, the response crackled back. Marcus had been found locked inside a bathroom stall upstairs, terrified but alive. The relief nearly knocked me to my knees. But there was no time to collapse. Ambulances screamed into the lot, paramedics rushing with stretchers. They went straight to Mia, whose breathing was shallow despite the oxygen. I followed, climbing into the ambulance when they loaded her in. Her hand found mine on the ride to the hospital. Every bump made her flinch and squeeze harder. I murmured, "You're safe now," though even to my own ears the words sounded fragile. The hospital was pandemonium, parents crying, teachers pacing, stretchers everywhere. I stayed with Mia until her mother finally arrived. Then I stumbled into the hallway, dazed. That was when a fellow teacher, Ms. Reynolds, found me. Tears streaked her face. She grabbed my shoulders and sobbed, "They found another boy from your class. He was hiding in a supply closet. He's safe." My legs buckled. I sank to a bench, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of relief. But relief couldn't erase the images: Henderson crawling, bleeding, begging for help, Mason's eye at the door, the bullet holes glowing with hallway light. That night, the news confirmed what my eyes already knew. Principal Henderson had died from his injuries. Ms. Daniels, the secretary who had tried to let me call, was gone too. A custodian who had confronted Mason near the main office never made it out. 3 lives lost. Dozens shattered. I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, replaying every second. Henderson's denial, his threats, his crawl down the hallway. The guilt and fury tangled in my chest until I didn't know which one was stronger. I'd saved my students. But at what cost? The day after the shooting, I woke up in my apartment drenched in sweat. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. My chest was tight, my ears ringing as if the gunshots still echoed through the walls. I stumbled toward the kitchen only to find myself standing in front of the locked front door holding the aluminum bat like a shield. I didn't remember grabbing it. Sleep became a cruel joke. Each time I closed my eyes, I heard Mason's laugh, saw Henderson crawling down the hallway, blood soaking through his white shirt. I'd jerk awake at 3 a.m., convinced the door handle was turning. My partner tried to soothe me, but even their arms couldn't pull me out of the nightmares. During the day, I tried to focus by writing. I sat at the kitchen table and typed out everything I could remember: the times, the voices, Henderson's threats over the intercom, the words the dispatcher used. My hands shook with every keystroke, but I forced myself to capture it all. It wasn't just memory. It was evidence. Part of me believed if I documented enough, someone would understand why I had defied orders. Meanwhile, the news flooded every channel. Reporters camped outside Brookfield High, microphones shoved into the faces of parents speculating about motives, heroes, and failures. My name surfaced online within hours. Parents posted on social media, "Mr. Avery saved our kids. We owe him everything." That teacher panicked, made things worse. My son said the police had to rescue them because he overreacted. The divide sliced through me. Half of the community hailed me as a savior, the other half painted me as reckless, insubordinate, even dangerous. Then the email came. The subject line, "Important Procedures and Protocols." It was from the district's legal counsel, Ms. Carver. The message was a wall of legal jargon. All staff were reminded to refrain from discussing the incident publicly, refrain from speaking to the media without authorization, and remember that only district-approved statements should be shared. Any deviation could result in disciplinary measures. It was clear what mattered most to them: liability, not lives. 2 days later, an official envelope arrived at my door. Inside was a letter placing me on administrative leave pending investigation. The language was cold, clinical. I had violated district crisis response procedures by initiating an unauthorized lockdown and communicating with external agencies without principal approval. Until the investigation concluded, I was barred from campus and forbidden from contacting students or families. My hands shook as I read it. I'd saved 30 kids, but on paper I was the problem. I texted Ms. Reynolds, who had been my ally through the chaos. Her reply came within seconds. I got the same letter. "We need to keep records of everything." She told me she'd already filed formal requests for the 911 transcripts and the intercom logs. If the district wanted to bury the truth, we needed proof. Still, the suspension hit like a gut punch. Teaching wasn't just a job, it was my identity. Now I was cut off from my students, cut off from the one place where I felt I made a difference. At the grocery store, I caught people staring. Some whispered, "That's him," with gratitude in their eyes. Others looked at me with suspicion, as if I'd brought the danger myself. Notes began appearing on my car windshield. Some thanked me, written in shaky handwriting from parents who couldn't find the words in person. Others blamed me. If you had listened, Henderson would still be alive. The contradictions twisted my stomach into knots. Detective Monroe, the officer assigned to the case, called me one afternoon. Mason had turned himself in at his parents' house. Monroe explained that the boy's expulsion last year had been tied to a cafeteria fight. Henderson never reviewed the security footage that might have cleared him. Mason had been punished without trial, left to stew in his anger. I hung up with the detective and sat staring at my hands. Mason used to write sonnets in my class. He wasn't always a monster. Somewhere along the way, the system broke him. But I couldn't dwell on that, not when parents were still messaging me. Some called me a hero, some accused me of endangering their children. One father wrote, "If you had followed the chain of command, maybe fewer would have died." The chain of command. Henderson's chain. The same chain that left him bleeding on the tiles. The district summoned me for a meeting. Ms. Carver greeted me with a rehearsed smile, her office smelling of stale coffee. She used words like protocol and liability over and over, circling back to the same accusation. By defying Henderson, I had undermined authority. I wanted to scream, to shake her by the shoulders and shout, "Authority doesn't matter when kids are dying." Instead, I sat still, gripping the armrests of my chair, nodding through her patronizing lecture. She smiled the entire time, as if politeness could soften the blow of being branded negligent. Afterward, I drove to the temporary campus where classes had resumed. I only wanted to see my students, to reassure myself they were okay. But the security guard stopped me at the door. "You're not permitted here," he said, firm but not unkind. "I have to escort you back to your car." Teachers watched through the windows as I was led away. My cheeks burned with shame, as if I were a criminal. All I'd done was try to protect them. That night, the nightmares returned. In them, Henderson wasn't crawling away from Mason. He was crawling toward me, eyes wide with accusation. "You disobeyed," he mouthed. "You killed me." I woke gasping, clutching the bat. 3 days later, Ms. Reynolds texted again. "The district only cares about lawsuits. They're trying to make scapegoats out of us." She was right. The investigation wasn't about justice, it was about control. And I couldn't shake the truth that no matter what the paperwork said, I had made the right choice. The weeks after my suspension blurred into one another, a fog of sleepless nights and therapy appointments. At first, I couldn't even walk past a school building without my pulse spiking. The sound of a car backfiring sent me diving for cover. Fireworks in the distance left me curled in my bathroom, palms pressed to my ears, waiting for the next explosion that never came. But slowly, piece by piece, life stitched itself back together. The district eventually offered me a position at Eastbrook Alternative Learning Center. The salary was $12,000 less, the benefits stripped down, but I couldn't afford to refuse. My savings were draining and my apartment lease was nearing renewal. Pride couldn't pay rent. The first time I walked into Eastbrook, the differences were stark. Metal detectors framed the entrance, staffed by 2 guards who checked every bag. Security cameras blinked in every corner. The principal proudly showed me the reinforced classroom doors and panic buttons like he was advertising a new car instead of a workplace. The classrooms were smaller, filled with students who'd been suspended or expelled elsewhere. Kids labeled troublemakers or lost causes. I could see the weariness in the other teachers' eyes, the exhaustion of holding a fragile system together. One of them pulled me aside and said, "It looks rough. But once you get to know the kids, it's not so bad." I spent 3 days wavering before signing the contract. When I finally did, it wasn't with hope, but with resignation. Survival demanded it. On my first day, I carried a cardboard box of supplies I'd bought myself: markers, notebooks, paper the school budget couldn't cover. The students sized me up, whispering behind their hands. I pretended not to hear. Once the lesson began, though, the walls between us cracked. I still knew how to teach, and some part of them still wanted to learn. Everything went fine until the lockdown drill. The alarm blared suddenly, shrill and merciless. My chest clenched. My vision tunneled. Before I realized it, I was in the staff restroom, retching into the sink, my hands trembling so violently I couldn't even turn the lock. I lied when colleagues asked if I was okay. I lied to Ms. Reynolds when she texted to ask about my first day. "It was fine," I typed, though my hands were still shaking. The state released its official report that same week. 20 pages of bureaucratic language, delayed lockdown procedures, communication failures, inadequate response protocols. My name was nowhere in it. Neither was Henderson's refusal to act. The report made it sound like tragedy had simply struck, as if no decisions had been made, no warnings ignored. I threw the document across the room. Mason's preliminary hearing followed. I was subpoenaed to testify. Walking into the courtroom, seeing him in an orange jumpsuit with his head bowed, was like a stone pressing into my chest. He looked smaller than I remembered. Younger. His lawyer whispered constantly in his ear while he stared at the table. The prosecutor questioned me for 2 hours. I described the sounds the barricade the bullets through the door. Mason didn't look at me once. And I felt something sickening fury at what he'd done, but also pity for the boy I once knew who used to write poems about rivers. After court, I sat at my laptop drafting letters to Henderson's widow. I wrote 5 versions trying to find words to bridge the impossible gap between anger and sorrow. But none of them felt right. What could I possibly say that her husband's stubbornness had nearly killed us all yet? I still wished he'd lived. In the end, I left the drafts unsent, the cursor blinking like an accusation. The bat I'd carried that day ended up rolling in my trunk, thudding whenever I turned. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was useless as a weapon, but it had been the only thing between me and death. Months later, I finally moved it into my garage, then into the attic, sealed in a box labeled Old Stuff. My therapist called it progress. I wasn't so sure. The trial dragged on, delays piling up. Finally, Mason pled guilty, 40 years with parole possible after 25. Online arguments erupted, too harsh for a boy bullied by the system, too lenient for a killer. I stopped reading. Justice, I realized, was just as messy as memory. Meanwhile, small signs of healing appeared. Ms. Reynolds started a support group for teachers who'd survived violence. We sat in her living room once a month sharing nightmares and panic attacks, the way a locker slamming made us flinch. No one tried to find silver linings. Sometimes the only comfort was knowing someone else understood. Former students began reaching out too. One messaged me on Facebook, "Thank you for keeping us safe. I'm working at a bank now." Another wrote about graduating early, attaching a photo in her cap and gown. Each message carried a weight, a reminder that we were all still carrying pieces of that day. At Eastbrook, I kept teaching. My students didn't care about Shakespeare or grammar, but they showed up most days. And slowly I stopped shaking every time a book dropped or a door slammed. One Tuesday, in the middle of a lesson on metaphors, a textbook slipped off a desk and hit the floor with a bang. My students barely reacted. And for the first time, neither did I. My heart didn't lurch. My hands didn't reach for the door. I just kept talking about how metaphors connect unlike things, and the kids kept scribbling notes. When the bell rang, they packed up and left, chatting about lunch and weekend plans. I stood at the board erasing chalk, realizing I'd made it through an entire period without checking the lock once. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't closure, but it was enough.